Clean water was one of the rarest and most dangerous luxuries in the Middle Ages. For most medieval people, water was not something pure, safe, or refreshing. It was a constant source of fear, illness, and death. Every cup of water carried risk, and every sip could become a slow poison. Unlike today, where clean water flows effortlessly from taps, medieval society lived without reliable sanitation, filtration, or understanding of contamination. Water was everywhere, yet safe water was almost nowhere. Medieval cities and villages relied heavily on rivers, wells, cisterns, and rainwater collection. On paper, these sources seemed sufficient. In reality, they were exposed to relentless pollution. Rivers served as transportation routes, dumping grounds, sewers, and water supplies all at once. Human waste, animal carcasses, blood from slaughterhouses, tanning chemicals, household refuse, and rotting food were all routinely thrown into the same rivers that people used for drinking, cooking, and washing. The concept of separating clean water from waste simply did not exist. Wells, often considered safer than rivers, were far from clean. Many were shallow and dug close to latrines, animal pens, or garbage pits. Waste seeped through the soil and into groundwater, contaminating wells invisibly. People believed clear water was clean water. If it did not smell or look foul, it was assumed to be safe. In reality, deadly bacteria thrived unseen. Entire households could fall ill after drawing water from a well that had been quietly poisoned by nearby waste. Rainwater collection was another common method, especially in cities. Water was collected from rooftops and stored in barrels or cisterns. But medieval roofs were covered in dirt, bird droppings, soot, decaying leaves, and sometimes dead animals. The rain washed all of this into storage containers, where water stagnated for weeks or months. Without proper sealing or cleaning, these containers became breeding grounds for insects, algae, and disease. Water scarcity worsened during dry seasons and winters. Rivers shrank, wells ran low, and stored water became stale and dangerous. Ice-covered rivers forced people to break through frozen surfaces to access water that was often even more polluted beneath. In times of drought, desperation drove people to drink from sources they knew were unsafe. Survival often meant choosing between dehydration and disease. Medieval people lacked any understanding of microbes or pathogens. Disease was blamed on bad air, divine punishment, planetary alignment, or moral corruption. When water caused sickness, it was rarely identified as the culprit. Instead, illness was attributed to fate or God's will. This ignorance allowed waterborne diseases to spread unchecked through entire communities. Dysentery, typhoid fever, cholera-like illnesses, and intestinal parasites were widespread. These diseases caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, fever, and internal bleeding. Children were especially vulnerable. Many died within days after drinking contaminated water. Adults who survived often suffered long-term weakness, malnutrition, and recurring illness. Outbreaks could wipe out large portions of a town without anyone understanding why. Cities made the problem far worse. As medieval towns grew rapidly, infrastructure failed to keep up. Streets were narrow and unpaved. Waste flowed openly through gutters or simply accumulated where it fell. During rainstorms, filth was washed directly into wells and rivers. In densely populated areas, hundreds or thousands of people depended on the same water sources, amplifying the spread of disease. Public baths, once common in Roman times, declined significantly in much of medieval Europe. Where they existed, they often reused water between bathers. These baths became centers for spreading infections rather than preventing them. Washing clothes or bodies in rivers further polluted drinking water downstream. There was no concept of upstream protection or downstream consequence. Brewing beer and ale became one of the few safer ways to consume liquid. Alcoholic fermentation killed some harmful organisms, making weak beer safer than water in many regions. Even children drank diluted ale daily. This was not a luxury or indulgence, but a survival strategy. Water was so unreliable that people trusted fermented drinks more than clear streams. However, beer and ale required grain, time, and equipment. During famines or shortages, these options disappeared. The poor were forced back to unsafe water. Monasteries and wealthy households sometimes had access to cleaner private wells or spring-fed systems, but these were rare exceptions. Clean water was a privilege tied to wealth, location, and power. Rural villages were not immune. Livestock shared water sources with humans. Cows, pigs, sheep, and horses drank from the same streams and ponds. Their waste contaminated water continuously. Dead animals were often left near water or dumped directly into it. During floods, entire landscapes were soaked in filth, contaminating every source at once. Seasonal flooding was especially deadly. Rivers overflowed into homes, wells, and storage areas, spreading contamination everywhere. After floods receded, water sources looked normal again, but invisible dangers remained. Epidemics often followed floods, killing people weeks later without any visible connection to the disaster. Medical practices offered no protection. Doctors rarely advised boiling water, and even when they did, fuel was expensive and time-consuming to gather. Most people could not afford to boil all their drinking water. Herbal remedies and prayers were the main treatments. Once illness began, survival depended largely on luck and physical resilience. Clean water also affected food safety. Vegetables were washed in contaminated water. Meat was rinsed in rivers already polluted with blood and waste. Bread dough was mixed with unsafe water. Every meal carried hidden risks. Food poisoning was common, but rarely recognized as such. Infants faced extreme danger. Babies were fed water mixed with milk or gruel. Contaminated water caused fatal diarrhea in infants at terrifying rates. Many children never reached the age of 5, and unsafe water was a major reason. Mothers had no way of knowing why their children sickened and died. Religious beliefs sometimes worsened the problem. Holy water sources attracted crowds, spreading contamination through shared containers. Pilgrimages concentrated thousands of people around limited water supplies, overwhelming sanitation. Even sacred springs could become deadly during peak use. Attempts at regulation were limited and ineffective. Some cities passed laws forbidding dumping waste near wells or upstream, but enforcement was weak. Corruption, lack of manpower, and ignorance undermined these efforts. People continued old habits because alternatives did not exist. Only toward the late Middle Ages did some cities begin constructing rudimentary aqueducts or protected spring systems. Even these were fragile and limited to wealthy districts. Most people continued to rely on contaminated sources well into the early modern period. The daily fear of water shaped medieval life profoundly. Thirst was not just discomfort, it was a gamble. Drinking was never safe, only necessary. Every sip was taken with resignation, not confidence. Clean water was not expected. Illness was normalized. Death was accepted as part of life. Modern ideas of hygiene, sanitation, and public health simply did not exist. Without clean water, cities became breeding grounds for disease. Without understanding contamination, society remained trapped in a cycle of sickness and loss. Progress was slow, measured in centuries. Clean water was rare not because it did not exist in nature, but because medieval society lacked the tools, knowledge, and infrastructure to protect it. Rivers flowed, rain fell, springs emerged, yet safety was absent. Water, the source of life, became one of the most persistent threats to survival. To live in the Middle Ages was to live without trust in the most basic necessity. Clean water, something we now consider a human right, was then an uncertain miracle. And for countless medieval people, The simple act of drinking was a silent roll of the dice, played every single day.